Hello, welcome to my channel. I'm back with another 1,000-word story based on 5 random words, which I will display on screen. This one is called merry-go-round. Alice's dates were amongst the saddest experiences she'd ever had. As a 45-year-old double divorcee, she'd had her share of disappointment. Somehow, the 4 encounters Alice squeezed into the pandemic-restricted month of November 2020 felt desolate in a particularly demoralising way. Firstly, all of her dates were outdoors, since meeting inside was disallowed. Secondly, because nothing was open, Alice was left with drizzly walks around local parks or through deserted city streets. Sometimes she'd get a takeaway coffee or a cup of soup just to keep her hands warm. Lastly, the kind of men who agreed to meet a stranger for a melancholy stroll around a park, wearing surgical masks and dodging puddles and non-compliant strangers, were men seemingly lacking something vital. Chris, the tax auditor, had spoken entirely in non sequiturs, mostly about his narrowboat. Adam had been barely 5 feet tall, his deep booming voice oddly incongruous coming from such a slight frame. Rajinder was animated at first, and since he too was a designer, they'd at least had something in common. Then he got into the subject of his children, who lived with their mother in Mumbai, and he simply burst into tears. Alice spent the remainder of their date boosting Raj's spirit, whilst she felt her own dwindle away. Today she was with Carl, who was a doctor and a medical examiner, a job she hoped would be filled with excitement and intrigue. It's mostly certifying cause of death for RTA victims, cancer patients and suicides, Carl confessed 10 minutes into their wander down the South Bank. Tragic stuff, was all Alice could think to reply, half wishing she were back home, working on the academic book jacket she'd been putting off. The agency had been good to her, giving her a whole series to work on. She ought to be prioritising work. Not entirely, said Carl, whose German accent was subtle and whose sensitive features now betrayed a flicker of amusement. Last week I was called out to certify a fisherman who was removed from the Solent with a harpoon through his neck. Alice wasn't sure if she was supposed to laugh at this, and Carl wasn't offering any social cues. It seemed that he hadn't finished his anecdote. Only, he didn't drown, and the harpoon wouldn't have killed him either. In fact, he died from anaphylactic shock from a peanut butter sandwich he'd taken a bite out of shortly before loading the harpoon gun. I had to explain this to his grieving widow. Again, there was no indication that a humorous response was required. But my role is rarely as droll, said Carl, sinking back into a silence he seemed happy to let continue indefinitely. They had reached the peculiar chromium sculpture near the Hayward Gallery. Alice watched their figures warp and stretch across its surface. Raindrops ran down the scuffed metal in erratic rivulets. You don't enjoy it much, Alice said, cradling her latte. Carl took a sip of his green tea. He had long, delicate fingers, and for a brief moment Alice wondered if he would touch her as gently as he handled his silver thermos cup. She shook away the idly erotic thought and awaited his answer. It's fulfilling, in a sense, he began. I get the feeling I'm doing something useful, and I suppose I'm good at it, or I wouldn't be one of the few full-time examiners. Carl sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Not much joy in it, though, Alice asked rhetorically. That's it, Carl said with surprising vigour as they passed the closed bookshops and restaurants under the South Bank Centre. I bring people the answers they need, but not the comfort they want. Alice had a strong impulse to grab and squeeze his hand encouragingly. Carl was at least sensitive and thoughtful, qualities sorely lacking in both of her husbands. Sadly, the logistics wouldn't work, since they were both carrying drinks and umbrellas. She settled for a broad smile instead. Carl's eyes crinkled with amusement. He looked at least 10 years older than his Tinder profile picture, but his slightly jowly face still had a handsome structure underpinning it. For some reason, the Shakespearean phrase chop-fallen flitted into mind. Then she realised Carl wasn't smiling at her. He was looking at the whirling colour and noise of a distant merry-go-round. His brown eyes reflected the whirling horses as they approached from the desolate Christmas market under the Jubilee bridges. We had such an amusement in my hometown when I was a boy, he said. I loved it. Alice realised she hadn't asked him where he was from. Perhaps she could have a surreptitious look at his profile. It appeared during Oktoberfest and stay until New Year. Alice looked around at the serried ranks of wooden sheds, with single strings of bright yellow bulbs looped between them. Even if they were open, this place wouldn't hold a candle to any of the German markets she's seen in magazines. I've never been to a proper German market, Alice said softly. You must go, Carl said, his face suddenly brimming with enthusiasm. The "you" filled Alice with more sadness than she knew she could contain. Fancy a ride? She said, half joking. Yes, he said simply, with a look of gratitude on his face. Alice could suddenly see the boy this 55-year-old man had once been, stuffing his face with candy floss, skipping through puddles with trailing shoelaces. Buying 2 tickets from the surly-looking attendant and concealing their possessions behind a bollard, they climbed upon the brightly painted horses, whose faces were frozen in manic expressions of equine joy. Wurlitzer music chimed out Good King Wenceslas as Alice and Carl rose and fell upon their steeds. 1 minute into the ride, Alice realised she was grinning from ear to ear, as was her beau. My sister was right, Alice thought, as Carl reached across recklessly to squeeze her shoulder. Life is just better on horseback. And that's that one. That story is sort of vaguely harkening back to when I shot Sparks and Embers on the South Bank, and it was raining a couple of nights, and particularly the scenes by the chrome sculpture and the merry-go-round, obviously. And the last line, which I'm not sure is ideal, but it'll do for now until I think of something better. It's bizarrely a reference to a Mike Oldfield song hidden at the end of Omadon, which is called On Horseback, colloquially, and is about his rather short-lived enthusiasm for horse riding. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that, and if you did, there are lots of ways you can show your appreciation. You can subscribe if you aren't already. You can share this video on your feed. You could like or make a comment, or do all of the above. Anyway, much appreciated. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.